The air in the office felt heavier than usual. Conversations died down, fingers paused mid-typing, and all eyes turned to the doorway. She stood there, poised, confident, and unreadable. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked in, surveying the space with calm authority. To anyone else, it was just another day at work. But for those who had been here long enough, they recognized her instantly. A whisper rippled through the office. "Is that her?" someone muttered. The tension in the air thickened as she approached the HR department. Employees exchanged nervous glances, recalling the last time they had seen her. Only back then, she was not wearing a tailored suit. She was not holding a folder marked HR Director. And she certainly wasn't the boss. The former HR Director, now standing awkwardly near his desk, felt his stomach drop. He knew this woman. He remembered that face, though the last time he had seen it, she was on the other side of his desk, looking far less confident. He had been the one to reject her. Not just reject, humiliate. His fingers clenched at his sides as she stopped in front of him, her gaze steady. He could see the recognition in her eyes, the flicker of past emotions she was clearly pushing away. Then, she extended her hand toward him. "I look forward to working with you," she said, her voice even. For a moment, he didn't move. His mind reeled. How had this happened? How was she standing here, in charge, while he... His fingers twitched before he forced himself to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, steady. Not like before. Not like the nervous woman who had once walked into his office hoping for a chance. Around them, the entire department remained silent, watching the exchange unfold. No one knew what to say. And no one knew what would happen next. The office wasn't always this silent. Years ago, it was a lively place filled with the usual buzz of corporate life. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the soft hum of printers, and the occasional burst of laughter from break-room conversations, it all seemed welcoming to outsiders. That's exactly how she had felt the first time she walked into this company, carrying nothing but her portfolio and the weight of her dreams. She had spent weeks preparing for the interview, going over every possible question, rehearsing her answers in front of the mirror, and researching the company inside and out. She had dressed in her best, confidence stitched into every thread of her outfit. But none of it mattered. The moment she stepped into the interview room, she felt something was off. The man sitting across from her, him, barely glanced at her resume. His fingers drummed against the desk in impatience as if he had already made up his mind. "Tell me," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what makes you think you're the right fit for this company?" She had answered, her voice steady, listing her qualifications. Her experiences, her passion for the industry. His smirk was barely concealed. "Passion doesn't replace experience," he said coldly. "And honestly, you just don't seem like someone who'd fit our company culture." She blinked, caught off guard. She had expected tough questions, maybe even a bit of skepticism. But she hadn't expected this. "I don't understand," she had said carefully. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" His tone remained casual, dismissive. "You lack leadership presence. You seem too eager. And we need someone with a stronger image." Stronger image? Her throat tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "I assure you, I'm capable of handling the responsibilities," he waved a hand, cutting her off. "Look, let's be honest. Some people have it. Some don't." His voice was patronizing, his smile infuriatingly smug. "We're looking for someone more polished. More confident. Maybe try again in a few years." The words burned. She sat frozen for a moment before forcing herself to nod. She gathered her things, stood up, and extended a polite, shaking hand. "Thank you for your time," she said. He didn't even bother shaking it. Instead, he was already reaching for the next resume on his desk. By the time she walked out of the office, she barely made it to the parking lot before the tears came. She never forgot that moment. The feeling of humiliation. The self-doubt that crept in, whispering, maybe he's right. Maybe you're not enough. But she was wrong to believe that. And now, she was the one standing at the top. She didn't get into her car right away after that humiliating interview. She sat in the driver's seat, staring at the building she had just been rejected from. The words still echoed in her mind. Some people have it. Some don't. Her fingers clenched around the steering wheel. She had worked so hard, prepared for weeks, only to be dismissed like she was nothing. Was she really not good enough? Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she took a deep breath, turned on the ignition, and drove away, not just from the company but from the doubt creeping into her mind. If they wouldn't give her a chance, she would make one for herself. The struggle begins. The next few months were brutal. She applied to every job she could find, but rejection after rejection piled up. Some companies said she was overqualified, others said she lacked experience. Bills started stacking up. She had savings, but they were draining fast. She took whatever work she could find, part-time, freelance, even odd jobs, just to stay afloat. Some nights, she lay awake wondering if she had made a mistake chasing this dream. But every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of that interview. Of the smug look on his face. She refused to let him be right about her. A ray of hope one day, while scrolling through job postings. She saw a small, growing company looking for HR assistants. The pay wasn't great, but she didn't hesitate. She sent her resume, expecting another rejection. But instead, she got an interview. This time, there was no condescending smirk, no dismissive tone. The manager actually listened to her. By the end of the interview, he smiled and said, "You remind me of myself when I started. We could use someone like you." For the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope. She threw herself into the job, learning everything she could. She stayed late, took extra courses, and absorbed knowledge like a sponge. She didn't just do the work, she mastered it. Her boss noticed. Within a year, she was promoted. Within 3 years, she became the head of the HR department. And within 5 years? The very company that had rejected her was now being acquired by her new employer. And they needed a new HR director. The full circle moment when she saw the job posting, she felt her heart pound. She had moved on from that place, from that moment of rejection. But something inside her told her she needed to go back, not for revenge, but for closure. So, she applied. Not as a desperate job seeker. Not as a woman begging for a chance. But as the person she had become, stronger, smarter, and more than capable. And when she got the offer, she didn't hesitate. Now, she was back in that same office. But this time, she wasn't the one being interviewed. She was the one in charge. The tension in the office was impossible to ignore. She had expected it, of course. No one forgets a moment of public humiliation, especially when the tables turn years later. She knew her presence alone unsettled people, particularly one person. The former HR director. Now sitting at a desk that wasn't his own. He hadn't said much after their handshake on her first day. He'd mumbled a stiff, welcome, and then retreated, watching from a distance as she settled into her new role. She could feel the stares as she moved through the department, meeting employees, reviewing policies, and assessing the current workflow. Some people whispered, others avoided her gaze, and a few exchanged uncertain smiles. She could tell they were wondering, was she here for revenge? Would she make changes just to prove a point? Would she fire the man who had once humiliated her? Breaking the silence, the tension reached a breaking point during a morning meeting with her new team. Employees sat stiffly, eyes shifting between her and the former HR director. She cleared her throat and looked around. "I can sense there's some unease," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I understand why." The room was silent. "I know some of you remember me from years ago," she continued, her voice calm. "And I remember this company, too. But I'm not here to settle scores." A few employees exchanged glances. "My goal is simple. I want this department to be the best it can be. I want people to want to work here, not dread it." A few nods. Some relaxed shoulders. She looked directly at the former HR director, who had his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "That includes working with everyone, past differences aside." For the first time, his mask slipped. He looked surprised. As if he'd expected her to come in swinging, demanding his resignation, maybe even humiliating him in front of the team. But she wouldn't do that. She wasn't him. Resistance and doubt despite her words, some employees weren't quick to warm up to her. There were whispers, doubts about whether she was truly qualified for the role. Some assumed she had only gotten the position because of the company merger. Others simply refused to forget the past. And then, of course, there was him. The former HR director seemed to be waiting for her to make a mistake. He attended every meeting, but rarely spoke. When he did, his words were clipped, careful. He followed orders, but only the bare minimum. He was testing her. She knew it. And she wasn't about to fail. Making her mark instead of getting caught up in the office politics, she focused on results. She started by reviewing old hiring practices and policies. What she found was concerning. Bias in hiring. Overlooked complaints. A culture that discouraged internal promotions. It was exactly the kind of system that had once rejected her. But instead of dwelling on the past, she got to work. She implemented fair hiring policies, introduced employee development programs, and scheduled one-on-one meetings with staff to understand their concerns. Slowly, she began winning people over. Employees who had once doubted her started to see real changes. They saw her not as the woman who had been rejected years ago, but as a leader who wanted to build something better. But there was one person who still wasn't convinced. The former HR director. And he was about to make his move. The change in the office was undeniable. What had once been a place of stiff formalities and silent tension was beginning to shift. Employees spoke more openly. Conversations during meetings felt less forced. The new policies were taking effect, and for the first time in years, people felt they had a voice in the company. But not everyone welcomed the change. One person, in particular, made no effort to hide his disapproval. The former HR director. Though he followed protocol and attended meetings, his demeanor was cold and distant. He never outright defied her, but his actions, or lack of actions, made his stance clear. He was waiting. Watching. And today, he finally made his move. The confrontation the moment she stepped into her office that morning, she found him already inside, standing by her desk. His presence wasn't surprising, but the look in his eyes was different, more resolute, more threatening. She shut the door behind her and calmly set down her bag. "Something on your mind?" she asked, keeping her voice even. He exhaled sharply. "We both know why you're really here." She raised an eyebrow. "Do we?" He crossed his arms. "You want revenge. Admit it." She didn't flinch. "That's what you think?" "I know it." He stepped closer. "You come back here, after all these years, and now you're my boss. You expect me to believe that's just coincidence?" She met his gaze, unshaken. "It's not a coincidence," she admitted. "I worked for this. I earned this." He scoffed. "Earned? Please. You didn't earn this." You were handed this position because of the merger. You just happened to be in the right place at the right time. She remained silent for a moment, letting his words settle. She had expected something like this, needed it, even. She leaned back against her desk, folding her arms. So, what are you saying? He exhaled through his nose. I'm saying you don't belong here. You were rejected for a reason. People like you. He stopped himself, but she caught it. Her stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. People like me, she repeated. His jaw clenched, as if realizing he had said too much. I meant, she cut him off. I know exactly what you meant. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she pushed off the desk and took a step forward. You're right about one thing, she said. This isn't a coincidence. I came back because I saw an opportunity. Not for revenge, but for change. His lips pressed into a thin line. She continued. The problem isn't that I'm here. The problem is that you can't accept that I deserve to be here. He stiffened, but she wasn't finished. I used to think about that interview a lot, she admitted. About the way you dismissed me. The way you made me feel like I wasn't good enough. She tilted her head. But you know what's funny? I should be thanking you. His brows furrowed. What? She smiled. Calm, steady, in control. You forced me to prove myself. To work harder. To become someone even I wasn't sure I could be. She glanced around the office. And now? I don't need your approval. I never did. For the first time, he looked uncertain. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. But before he could speak, she gave him one final push. You have two choices, she said. You can keep resisting, keep fighting against me, and hold on to whatever pride you have left. She shrugged. Or you can work with me. Help fix what's broken. Silence. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the office. The door clicked shut behind him. She exhaled, steadying herself. This wasn't over. Not yet. The office carried a different energy now. Some employees had warmed up to her leadership, seeing the changes she was implementing. Others remained skeptical, waiting for her to prove herself further. But one thing was clear, she wasn't going anywhere. However, not everyone was ready to accept that. And she was about to uncover something that would shake the company to its core. A suspicious lead. It started with a simple email. An anonymous message landed in her inbox late at night, just as she was reviewing the latest hiring reports. The subject line read, "You should look into this." Attached was a folder of documents. Hiring records, payroll data, and performance reviews. But as she skimmed through them, her stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Certain names appeared repeatedly, employees who had been promoted despite poor performance, candidates who had been hired without proper qualifications, and alarming salary discrepancies. At first, she thought it was just negligence. But as she dug deeper, she realized it was intentional. People weren't being hired or promoted based on merit. They were being paid off. Connecting the dots, the deeper she went, the worse it got. Some employees had bribed their way into higher positions. Others had been hired through backdoor deals, bypassing the official recruitment process. And at the center of it all? The former HR director. The same man who had once looked her in the eye and told her she wasn't a good fit. Now, she had proof that he was the one who had been manipulating the hiring process. The irony was almost laughable. The decision she had every reason to expose him immediately. But something held her back. This wasn't just about him. It was about the entire system. If she handled this wrong, innocent employees could suffer, and the company's reputation could take an irreversible hit. She needed to be smart. She needed leverage. So instead of acting impulsively, she called for a closed-door meeting with senior management. They needed to hear the truth. The room was silent as she presented the evidence. One by one, she laid out the reports, the fraudulent records, the bribes, all of it. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided eye contact. When she finally finished, she leaned forward, her voice steady. This has been going on for years. And it ends now. Silence. Then, a voice from across the table. What do you propose? She took a breath. This was the moment. We do this the right way. A full audit, transparency with the employees, and disciplinary action against those involved. She let her gaze land on each of them. If we cover this up, it will happen again. Another pause. Then, slowly, one executive nodded. Then another. One of them glanced at the former HR director's name in the report and sighed. What do we do about him? Her fingers tapped lightly on the table. She had thought about this long and hard. Finally, she spoke. I want to talk to him first. The room stiffened. Talk to him, someone repeated. After everything he's done? She nodded. Yes. Because before she took everything away from him, she needed to hear his side of the story. And she needed to know why he did it. The former HR director sat across from her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He knew why he had been called into this meeting. He had been expecting it. She pushed the folder across the desk toward him. Take a look, she said, her voice calm but firm. He didn't touch it. Instead, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. So, this is it? You finally got what you wanted. She frowned. What exactly do you think I want? He let out a dry laugh. Don't play innocent. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? Ever since I turned you away all those years ago. She leaned forward, her gaze steady. What I wanted was a fair system. A company where people don't get rejected because of bias or favoritism. She nodded toward the folder. And you were the biggest problem. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt. Regret. Fear. The justification. He finally picked up the file, flipping through the pages. You don't understand how it works, he muttered. You think companies survive on talent alone? You think I had a choice? She narrowed her eyes. You always have a choice. He scoffed. I did what I had to do to keep things running. Do you know how much pressure there is in this position? Executives expect results. They expect loyalty. Sometimes, the best way to keep a company stable is to make sure the right people are in place. She folded her arms. And who decides who the right people are? You? His silence was enough of an answer. A different perspective. She sat back, exhaling slowly. You know, for a long time, I thought about that interview. He didn't meet her eyes. I thought about how you looked at me like I wasn't worth considering. Like I wasn't good enough. She shook her head. But I realize now, it was never about me. That made him look up. You weren't rejecting me, she continued. You were protecting your own system. Keeping people like me out, because if I got in, I might actually force you to change things. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Because deep down, he knew she was right. The offer. She let the silence stretch before speaking again. Here's what's going to happen, she said. He straightened. You can walk away. Resign. Leave this company, and let the rest of us clean up the mess you left behind. His jaw tightened. Or, she continued, you can fix it. He blinked. Fix it? She nodded. I don't need you gone, I need you to undo what you did. She leaned forward. I want full cooperation. I want the names of everyone involved in this corruption. I want you to help dismantle this system instead of being part of the problem. He stared at her, stunned. She gave him a moment before finishing. You've spent years making decisions that only benefited a select few. Here's your chance to do something that benefits everyone. Silence. Then, slowly, he exhaled. For the first time since she had returned, the arrogance in his eyes dimmed. He wasn't just facing the truth, he was accepting it. She didn't know what choice he would make. But for the first time, she saw the possibility of change. The former HR director sat motionless, his fingers gripping the edge of the file. His mind raced, searching for a way out, an excuse, anything that could justify what he had done. But the weight of the evidence, and her unwavering gaze, left him with nothing. He finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. You really think people are going to accept this? That they'll just forgive and move on? She didn't hesitate. No. And they shouldn't. His eyes flickered up to meet hers. But they might respect you for taking responsibility, she continued. For once in your life, you can do something right instead of something convenient. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. You make it sound so easy. She shook her head. It's not easy. It's necessary. A decision is made. The silence in the room stretched. Then, slowly, he pushed the file back toward her. I'll cooperate. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. But not for you. She raised an eyebrow. For myself, he clarified. Because if I don't fix this, I'll have to live with it. That was enough. She nodded, standing. Then let's get to work. Unraveling the system over the next few weeks, everything changed. With his help, she exposed the web of corruption that had controlled hiring decisions for years. Every fraudulent promotion, every biased decision, and every unethical deal was brought to light. She made it clear, there would be no cover-ups, no sweeping things under the rug. Some employees, once skeptical of her leadership, now saw her for what she was, a force for change. The company launched a full investigation. Executives who had turned a blind eye were held accountable. Policies were rewritten. A fair system was finally being put in place. The former HR director's fate. As for him, he resigned. It was clear that even though he had helped clean up the mess, his reputation was too damaged to stay. He knew it, and so did she. But before he left, he did something unexpected. He walked into her office, his usual arrogance gone. I owe you an apology, he admitted. For the way I treated you back then. For everything. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. I accept your apology. A pause. Do you regret it? She asked. His lips pressed together. I regret that I didn't see your worth sooner. Then, with a faint, tired smile, he extended his hand. This time, she hesitated, but only for a second. She shook his hand. No resentment. No anger. Just closure. A new beginning. When she walked through the office that afternoon, she could feel the difference. Employees were no longer whispering behind closed doors. They were talking, collaborating, trusting. For the first time, the company wasn't being controlled by politics and favoritism. It was built on merit. And she had made that happen. As she stepped into her office, she glanced at the window, at the city skyline stretching before her. Years ago, she had walked out of this building feeling like a failure. Now, she stood at the top. Not because she had wanted revenge. But because she had earned it. And that was worth more than any apology. She sat alone in her office, the city lights flickering outside her window. The journey that had brought her here had been long, filled with struggle, rejection, and self-doubt. But as she looked around at the space she now commanded, she felt something she hadn't expected: peace. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving herself right. A moment of reflection, she leaned back in her chair, remembering the woman she used to be, the one who had walked into this office years ago, filled with hope, only to be crushed by the rejection of a man who had believed she wasn't the right fit. That moment had almost defined her. Almost. Instead, she had chosen to define herself. Her phone buzzed with a message. "Congratulations. The company is in good hands now." It was from the former HR director. She let out a slow breath, not with triumph, but with understanding. People could change. Maybe not always, and maybe not completely. But sometimes, when given the chance, they could make things right. He had made his choice. And she had made hers. The final meeting the next morning, she called for a company-wide meeting. Employees gathered, curious about what was coming next. She stood at the front, calm and composed. "I know the last few weeks have been difficult," she began. "Change isn't easy, and trust isn't built overnight. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that a company is only as strong as the people who believe in it." She looked around, meeting their gazes. "I want to thank those of you who have supported these changes, and I want to challenge those who are still hesitant. Because this isn't just about policies, it's about fairness. It's about earning your place, not just being given it." A ripple of nods moved through the crowd. For years, decisions were made based on connections, not qualifications. That ends now. From this moment on, hard work will speak louder than favors. And I promise you, if you show up, if you put in the effort, you will be recognized. A silence settled over the room. And then, one by one, employees began to clap. Not out of obligation. But because they believed her. And that meant everything. The final lesson that night, as she left the office, she paused by the doorway, the same one she had walked through years ago after being told she wasn't good enough. But this time, she wasn't leaving in defeat. She had come back, not to destroy, but to build. Not to prove others wrong, but to prove herself right. She had learned that rejection wasn't the end of the road. It was just a redirection. And sometimes, what feels like the worst day of your life is actually setting you up for your greatest success. With one last glance at the company she had fought for, she walked out, head held high, heart full, and future unstoppable.